Hi, my name's Robert Williams, and we're here on a brisk January day, and we're taking a tour of some of the great literary landmarks in Westport. And I could think of no better person than the voice of Westport to many here in town. He's one of the great contemporary journalists. He's been a columnist for the Westport News since the mid-'80s. Most of us in town wake up each morning to one of his blog emails from 06880, no other than Dan Woog. Hi Dan, how are you?
Very good, very cold.
Yes, it's brisk today, so much for global warming. There's no fitting place to start our tour than the house where F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda spent 1920 here in Westport, and that's where we are today, Dan.
That's right, it was the summer of 1920. They were renters. South Campo Road was a dirt path, and they ended up here. It's where F. Scott wrote Tender is the Night, and the house that they rented here, built in 1780, is behind what is now Longshore Club. Back in 1920, Longshore was fields, onion fields, and he could see all the way from this house across Long Island Sound to Long Island. And some people believe that that view really informed much of what is the Great Gatsby.
That's interesting.
It was a wild time in Westport. There are people who remember F. Scott and Zelda riding in their roadster down South Campo on the way to some wild parties. Whether they wore clothes or not is a matter of some dispute. But he was one of many. He and Zelda were two of many writers and people who made Westport the artist colony that it became known as.
It was a great bootlegging town back then also, wasn't it? Maybe that was the spark of creativity that created all these great writers. One of the great feminist writers here in Westport, Anne Morrow Lindbergh's house.
Charles Lindbergh was obviously very well known, but after the kidnapping, he and his wife lived in many different places. One of them was here in Westport. She wrote on a variety of subjects, including love, marriage, the environment, and the world around. And this was one of the places where she wrote Gift to Yourself.
Yeah, that came out in 1955, and it was one of the most seminal feminist pieces of writing of the 20th century. You might be wondering why we're at the Rolnick Observatory, since this is a literary tour of Westport, but this is actually the site of where the Nike complex was, which was the subject of Max Schulman's book, Rally Around the Flag Boys. This is a great book for anyone that lives in Westport because it's actually a time capsule into what Westport was like in the 50s. I'm going to read just a brief paragraph and then we'll get Dan to talk a little bit about it. "All right," said George Melvin, realtor. "We'll take your word for it that Nike isn't dangerous. But you can't tell me it's not dangerous to property values. Here in Putnam's Landing, we've got some of the finest, most valuable real estate in the whole country. What happens when the Army moves in with a big, ugly, noisy camp?" Well, that was written in 1958, and here we are in that noisy, ugly camp. Take it away, Dan.
In the 1950s, the United States military needed a defense system to shoot down the incoming Russian missiles. One of the cities that needed to be protected was Bridgeport because of all its defense and electronic manufacturing. Nike sites needed to be sited on high land, and there were two of them in Westport. One was on North Avenue, which is now the site of Bedford Middle School, and the launch area, which had to be even higher, was here off Bayberry Lane, now the site of the Rolnick Observatory. Max Schulman's satirical novel, Rally Round the Flag, was made into a movie later, starring Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. That's the way they got to Westport, through Max Schulman. Max, of course, went on to write many other books, and he created the character of Dopey Gillis.
There are many different types of writers that were in Westport: film, journalists, books, literature, fiction, nonfiction, and also television. And probably the most famous of all the television writers was Rod Serling. And Dan, you've had some interesting stories to share with us about Rod, because you just lived down the street from him.
I did. I was very young, 3 or 4 years old. Rod Serling came to Westport in the mid-1950s and lived on High Point Road. And it was there that he wrote some of his most famous craft Playhouse Theater and Playhouse 90 live television dramas, including Patterns, which really started his career. From time to time, Rod would wander up High Point Road and spend time visiting and writing in the home of my parents. Both my father and Rod went to Antioch College together. Based on the success of some of his television dramas, Rod was invited out to Hollywood to write for a new CBS show called Twilight Zone. So he left Westport in the late 1950s, but some of his greatest works were done in Westport, and Westport formed the basis for one of the most famous Twilight Zone episodes of all time, Next Stop, Willoughby, about a commuter from New York to Westport who ends up not in Westport, but in the 1880s.
That's interesting. He was covering that theme of going to work every day in New York, and he felt like he was overburdened by having a big mortgage, wife and kids, and it was too much pressure for him, that maybe he'd taken on too much. A theme that Max Schulman explores in Rally Around the Flag Boys. Very interesting. You see some of that theme that occurs here in the 21st century with people struggling with mortgages when the economy was really bad.
And not only was that a theme, but Rod and Max Schulman were surrounded by writers of all types. Fiction writers, newspaper writers, magazine writers, playwrights, and advertising men.
Yeah, the Mad Men were quite a big population here in Westport.
And they all hung out together and I guess traded tips, traded stories, and traded writing techniques.
And that's why illustrators were a big part of the community here also, because they were doing a lot of the advertising drawings.
That's right.
Yeah. We're at the site of the famous Artists School, which then morphed into the famous Writers School. There was a photography school also. Many people around the country heard of Westport through this famous series of artistic and writing academia. Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. It's known now as Save the Children here on Wilton Road, but in the late 50s, Albert Dorn, noted illustrator, founded the famous Artist School, and soon added famous Writers School and famous Photographer School. Bennett Cerf helped start it. Bruce Catton, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Faith Baldwin, noted romance novelist, were also involved, and many people around the country, around the world, really knew of the famous Writers School correspondence course by seeing the advertisements on matchbook covers and magazines.
That's what I remember from the matchbook covers.
That's right, and they had a noted faculty, some of whom probably actually instructed students in how to write.
It's impossible for us to hit all the important literary landmarks here in Westport, but one of the beauties of stopping by 36 Calvary Road is that we're stopping by Albert Erskine's house. He was the editor at Random House, and some pretty amazing books were worked on in this house behind me. He worked with William Faulkner, James Michener, Eudora Welty. He also worked on The Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's book. He also worked on Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano, and also Fairfield's Robert Penn Warren. It's interesting, there are quite a few Random House connections. We were at the famous Writers School, which was Bennett Cerf, who was also a Random House man. So there was a lot of literary activity with executives, editors also in town. I wanted to share with you a quote from Eudora Welty. As she was saying, he did a very great deal for my work. I remember on my novel, Losing Battles, he had me out to his house as a guest, eating wonderful food and having a lovely time every day. Right here is where Eudora Welty was hanging out, working on her work with Albert Erskine.